All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. This is our part 2 of our NIH Neurosurgery K12 webinar series. And we're very blessed today to have 2 great speakers who are really experts in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, also known as JEDI. And this is becoming such an important area of interest and topic amongst all of our institutions. And we're really fortunate to have two leaders in this at UCLA. And I thought that they would be perfect to give 2 presentations for us for the first half of our hour. In the second half, we're going to break down into small groups and meet for about 10-15 minutes, talk about some of the things that we learned today. And then we're going to come back together in our larger group and talk together. So I would like to begin by introducing first Dr. David McIntosh, who serves as our Vice Dean for JEDI at the David Geffen UCLA School of Medicine. Prior to that, he served at the Wake Forest Baptist Health as a Vice President and Chief Inclusion and Diversity Officer for the health system. And he's going to be speaking to us about how to incorporate JEDI principles into your academic program. So thank you so much, Dr. McIntosh.
Thank you, Dr. Holly. I appreciate it. Thank you for the kind words and the opportunity to be here today with y'all. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully we can see that. And then I'm going to switch this over to presenter view. And hopefully we're all looking at the same thing here. Okay, well, so it's really great to be here today. I'm really very excited to talk about how to fit JEDI into your academic program. I'm going to do this in 2 ways. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little context for the understanding of JEDI. I think anytime we start thinking about this, I mean, it's easy to default to definitions and things like that, but I want to give you some real world examples of why JEDI is important and critical to all of our work. And then I'm going to transition that to talking about how can we get this infused and inculcated into our systems, because that's really the gold standard. It's one thing to know these things, it's another thing to have them influence our systems and structures. So I start all my presentations and actually end all my presentations with a quote. I love this one by the late, great Maya Angelou. She said, do the best that you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. I love that for number 1, for the simplicity, because we can all easily remember that. We can put that in our back pocket and take it with us wherever we go. The second thing I love about it is that it suggests that we're all already doing our best. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, oh, I want to stick it to this group, or I can't wait for this person to fail. Nobody does that, especially in a healing profession like medicine. We're all doing our best, and that it pertains to JEDI, I believe, also. But we all have room to grow. There's room for us all to get better and more sophisticated in this work. So regardless of where you are in this continuum, myself included, we all have room to grow and learn in this work. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the history, because I think this is really important to understanding how we got to where we are and why this is so important to infuse into our systems and structures of academic medicine. You can see from this graph, and this is probably the simplest way I can describe race in America. When you look at this, you can see that for 62% of our country's history, people of color could be systematically excluded, and were systematically excluded from every vestige of our society: education, health, the opportunity to be a citizen, opportunity to vote, the opportunity to work, like all of those things. There was no humanity for people of color in our country because of the systems of chattel slavery. Now think about that for a second, because every governing doctrine that governs our society was invented at a time before Black people and people of color were considered human. That's an important point as we think about the systems and structures of today. Now, since then, of course, we had Reconstruction that lasted about 100 years. There were some tiny little bits of rights given, but not many. It really wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s that guaranteed people the right to be able to go to school, the right for fair education, transportation, opportunity to own land, things like that. But that's only been 14% of our country's history. So important to really keep this in context. And it's not just race. We have this, and I love this concept of mansplaining, but we have breathtaking misogyny that occurs in our country as well. And so it's really critical that we also remember that that the gendered norms and experiences also relate to every system and structure of our society. Remember that women didn't have the right to vote until the early 1900s. And so again, a great deal of our systems of governance were in place before there was the opportunity to vote, go to school, to own land, all of those things that are core to our systems of society and governance. Patricia Hill Collins is a very, very famous feminist scholar, and she said how a group's placement in a specific historical context of race, gender, and class inequality might influence their point of view in the world. I love that, because what it suggests is the way that we've been socialized to see the world influences how we interact with the world. And so really, really important as we think about the concepts that we're going to talk about today. I want to really quickly point to the ACGME. They have this really brilliant series called Equity Matters. They invited several scholars across manifold disciplines to talk about the realities of equity as you think about different identity and background domains. It's a whole library. It's completely free, and it's done by all of these amazing experts. So if you want more information about anything, I would really recommend that you check that out. Let me say that education alone will not solve your departmental and institutional issues. If it was true that by attending a presentation or going to an online training, we would somehow be able to solve our problems, we would have solved those problems 30 years ago, because we've all been going to so many trainings. But the education alone won't actually get you there. It has to be education paired with opportunities to change systems and structures. Now, how do you change a system and structure? How do you develop the opportunity to disrupt a social norm or an institutional norm? Friends, it starts with trust. When you are within an organization, you have to build yourself and your group and your mission as congruent with the goals of the organization, the goals of the department chair or the dean or the institutional leader. You have to build trust so that people will recognize you as a knowledge holder and believe the direction that you're trying to take an organization. Now, the gold standard in all of this is accountability. The opportunity for us to be accountable, to say what we're going to do is exactly congruent with what we want to do, which is congruent with what will be good for justice. Accountability has multiple components, and I'm looking at down the middle here right now. It's about establishing standards and commitments for what it is we're going to be and who we're going to be, collecting data on those things so that we can make good decisions and then measure the decisions and the results of that to ensure that the decisions we're making are appropriate and having the type of impact we think that those are having. And then we follow up with corrective actions and sometimes consequences for failures to uphold the standard. Now, that all sounds easy, but in practice, especially around JEDI, it can be very, very difficult, because we're talking about people's identities. We're talking about the background, and we're talking about the way people were raised and the things that they've come to believe are true in our society. Other components that are critical to this, and these are the two flanking areas: transparency and participation. If we do this, try to establish these standards and make these decisions and measure these results and have these consequences in a bubble without participation from the groups that we're seeking to serve, we're going to miss the mark. We have to do this in collaboration and in concert with all of our key stakeholders so that we're sure that we're meeting the expectations and the needs of our communities. On the other side, we have to be transparent with this. We have to tell people where we're going and why we're going there. We have to have a strong rationale and be able to live to that rationale. Without all three of these components, we will be failing our community in a really, really meaningful way. So again, accountability is really where the buck stops. This is what we need in order to change the systems and structures of an organization. Now, here's my model for JEDI. And to be honest, you can go online, you can go into the academic literature, and you can find a million different mechanisms for thinking about and talking about structural change relative to JEDI. I feel very, very drawn to this one. This is one that I helped develop at another university, and I've brought it here to UCLA, and we've had some really nice success implementing this. But what I've done is I've established 6 key areas for our departments to follow. And I'll talk about the process here in a second. But what we've asked all of our leaders to do is create a plan that is responsive to the community's needs and is measurable in each of these 6 areas. People refers to headcount and who's in the organization. Climate is how people feel or are made to feel in the organization. Professional development and education are the thing, like, remember I started the presentation by giving you all a little bit of education and background around some of these really core and key tenets. Professional development and education is how we know what we know. Structural equity are the systems and structures of our organization. So think about the policies, the programs, the practices and procedures, those things that are both written down, which are easy to identify, and all the unwritten rules, all of the ways that the practices, the things that aren't written down or interrogated or investigated by lawyers, all the ways that we make decisions that are sometimes just like, oh, I had a gut feeling, or I had an intuition about this. All of those things are really, really important for us to consider. I have a line there because those top four apply to any organization. It does not matter where you work. I don't care if you work at Howard Hughes, or if you work in an academic medical center, or if you work in private practice, or if you're just a physician scientist in the community. All four of those things apply. The last two are the ones that are unique to UCLA, and I think these would also apply to most organizations. But I think most organizations, whether you're a land grant institution or not, would say that community engagement is critically important. How we engage with our community members, what we say we're about, and ensuring that we're meeting the needs of our community. And then, if you're in medicine, if you're in healthcare, equitable care for your patients and your respondents, those who are participants in your studies, things like that. We have to have equitable care for all of those folks. So in our conception of this, what we've done is I've asked each of our 24 departments to create a plan for what they intend to do in each of these 6 key areas. Now, here's what's exciting is, like, that part is not novel. Creating a plan with goals and tactics and strategies and assessing those things, that is not novel. What we did at UCLA, which is a little bit novel, is we've asked each of our leaders to be publicly accountable for their plans. And so in 2 days, we will have all of the leaders of our organization come together and describe for all of their peers and all of the senior leaders at UCLA and in UCLA Health System and in the School of Medicine exactly what they've done in order to create change in their department relative to JEDI. That's a huge transparency thing. I mean, we're oftentimes an organization that keeps the cards close to the vest. So this is a big moment for people to be willing to share what they've worked on, what's been successful and what hasn't. At the end of that process, where after all 24 of our department chairs have shared, we have 12 evaluators who will be evaluating each of our departments. And that evaluation, the results of that, will be given to our dean to be used as evaluations of our department chairs, as well as for budget decisions for the next year for our department. That's accountability, friends. That's where the rubber meets the road, because now JEDI is on the exact same plane as budgets and HR issues and all the rest of the things that really count for a leader. JEDI has to be in that conversation and held to the same level of scrutiny and accountability as everything else. Otherwise, friends, it's just lip service. We've had 100 years of lip service, and we've gotten exactly where we are today. If we don't have accountable systems that create transparency and accountability for what we're trying to do here, then we don't have authenticity. We say we're about something, but we're not, because we're not holding ourselves accountable for this. I'm going to end on this slide here and turn it over to my friend and colleague, Mr. McNeil. But Paulo Freire, for those of you who don't know, is a very, very famous critical scholar. And he said, and I love this for medical audiences especially, he said, and never let it be said, if I'm a biology teacher, I must not go off into other considerations, that I must only teach biology as if the phenomenon of life could be understood apart from its social, historical, and socio-historical, cultural, and political framework. I love that because it interrogates that idea that somehow biology is objective, that somehow we could teach biology as if that could be separated from life. And sometimes I think in medicine, we believe that, we practice the objective science, and Dave and the rest of his social science nerds, they practice the social science that's not objective. But let me tell you a story, friends. My brother is a biology teacher, and I will tell you that the 2 subjects he teaches the most are exactly what this quote is about. My brother teaches evolution and climate change. Are there 2 more topics that are more controversial in the parlance of today's society in biology than climate change and evolution? I would argue that there are some, but not many. And so again, we have to consider all of this within the context of the historical moment. Think about that Patricia Hill Collins quote I told you a minute ago, where we all view the world through the lens of our lived experience. This is what we're talking about, and that we have to use that as we're building our accountable systems and structures. And I love using that quote here as I hand it off to my colleague, Mr. McNeil, who I believe will be talking about implicit bias. But Dr. Holly, let me turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dave. Anybody have any questions for Dr. McIntosh? I'll ask you this, Dave. What do you think has been your biggest challenges to get buy-in? Because you've been able to do this at different institutions, different parts of the country, different climates. What kind of is the biggest challenge that you found when you get started?
I think there's a fear element that goes along with doing this work and holding ourselves accountable to EDI, because people recognize that they might not think the way that I think about an issue. And so holding somebody accountable, like to their evaluation and to their budget, to something that they don't know and haven't been trained much about, is scary. I mean, if you started holding me accountable for doing some sort of brain surgery, spine thing, I'd be very scared too, because that's not what I learned in my PhD program. And so I could totally relate because we have been trained in different disciplines. And so it can be scary. But what I would say is that there is lots of opportunity for us to all be on the same side of this. And what I've assured all of our department chairs and all of our leadership is that we recognize that this is a process. And it's not that we're going to throw our department chairs off a cliff here. We're going to work with our department chairs so that we're learning and growing together, so that we're stepping towards the right, so that we can have a path to creating the environment that we want here at UCLA. And so I think it's just kind of the fear of the unknown.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. And so now I'd like to introduce our second presenter. This is Mr. Julian McNeil, who is the director of JEDI at the David Geffen UCLA School of Medicine. And he's an expert in many aspects of JEDI, including restorative justice circles, mentoring programs, and unconscious bias training. And he's also been one of the program directors of our anti-racist roadmap. And Julian, we'd love to hear a little bit about your knowledge about unconscious and implicit bias.
Thanks so much for that introduction. I'm just sharing my screen. I have a few slides that I'll share with the group. All right. Hopefully this is full screen for you, is it? No, it is not. Let me see. Apologies. All right, how was that? Great, I see some thumbs up. So once again, folks, my name is Julian McNeil. I'll be presenting a little bit on implicit bias today. Dave really took a kind of systems or broader approach in his work. I'm going to zoom in a bit and talk about something that really impacts individuals as well as our interactions with others.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias. Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes the shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to bias.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there is an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race.
So I'm actually going to stop us there. I started with that video. It's a part of a series that came out of the New York Times a few years ago that looks at implicit bias and some other related topics. I think it's a nice introduction to this space, right? And thinking about it as kind of described in the video, as a smog that we've been breathing in that really causes us to make these implicit associations, or what we know as, or sometimes call implicit bias, right? The Kirwan Institute defines implicit bias as follows. Also known as implicit social cognition, implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. These biases, which encompass both favorable and unfavorable assessments, are activated involuntarily and without an individual's awareness or intentional control. Residing deep in the subconscious, these biases are different from known biases that individuals may choose to conceal for the purpose of social and/or political correctness. Rather, implicit biases are not accessible through introspection, right? So keep that kind of definition in mind, and we can turn to it and debate it and talk about it at the end if there's time. I want to revisit this idea of heuristics in psychology, which are basically, I think of them as mental shortcuts that I take, or that we all take, or rules that people use to form judgments and make decisions. They typically reduce really complex problems down to something pretty simple, and once again, often operate kind of outside of awareness. So if I'm walking down the street, for example, and I don't know, I see that there is a crane dangling a large slab of concrete above the sidewalk, I might choose to cross the street so I don't have to walk underneath that giant slab of concrete, right? And that might just be something I do very quickly. And it's an example of a heuristic that I might use, right? I might see that crane and think, oh, danger, like, let me cross the street. And in many cases, these heuristics can be good, they can be helpful. But in many cases, they can be harmful as well. I think as described in the video, Dr. Sean Harper described like this association between Black males and violence, right? So you might be walking down the street and see a Black male and think, oh, violent, let me cross the street. That's an example of heuristic that is not as helpful, right, or harmful. Typically those bad heuristics are the ones that are harmful, we think of as mind bugs. So they're faulty in some way, and they become these ingrained habits of thoughts that lead to errors in how we perceive, remember, reason, and make decisions. We're likely to rely on heuristics and fall prey to mind bugs when there are three conditions that exist. Those three conditions are ambiguity, unreasonable time constraints, and unmet basic needs. Ambiguity, for example, might refer to if somebody's applying for residency or for a job. If there's unclear information about the applicant's competence or the applicant's background, folks will tend to rely on stereotypes and making implicit associations between folks that share the same kind of social demographics of the applicant and what they've, and the applicant themselves, right? Also, we're likely to rely on heuristics when there are unreasonable time constraints. So if we have a fast approaching deadline, or if we're in a meeting at the end of the day and we're asked to make decisions, and there's just not that much time, then we're likely to use those heuristics that I talked about. And then finally, when they're like unmet basic needs, so if we're hungry, if we're tired, if we're uncomfortable in some way, then we tend to rely on heuristics, and our judgment and decision making tends to decline and be worse than it ordinarily would be. So I bring these up because I actually want to talk about some interventions to counteract implicit bias and then make some explicit connections to the healthcare space. The interventions that I'm talking about now are all based on research, but I'll say now and I'll say later that they are contextual in some ways. So they might work in some spaces, but not others. And I'm just going to talk about three. This first one has to do with designing for objectivity. It's really my favorite intervention because it's the one that I'll talk about today that really preempts it at the beginning. The second one is practicing mindfulness, and the third is this priming with counter-stereotypical exemplars, and I'll stop there. So designing for objectivity really entails preventing mind bugs from impacting decision making, right? So we think about kind of the classic example of symphony orchestras. We know as late as the 1970s, the top 5 orchestras in the US had fewer than 5% women, and it wasn't until the 1980s that they had 10% women. And then in the 90s, that number really jumped to about between 25 and 30% women. Some of you might have heard this before, but we know what changed was that orchestras started holding these blind auditions, right? And at first, the percentage of women did not increase right away, just with simply like putting up a curtain, but they actually had to like ask women to remove their shoes. So the folks who were evaluating them did not see them as they walked out. We've tried, or I've employed this kind of idea of blinding certain elements of either application materials. And in some cases it works well, but also there have been instances where it hasn't worked. In some like organizational settings, if folks are really kind of looking for signals of diversity when they're like engaged in selection processes, whether it's for students or faculty members, and you blind much of that information, then folks can no longer like see those signals, right? So sometimes it actually works against what you're trying to accomplish, right? And it might end up in a less diverse workforce or less diverse incoming class. So it's something to keep in mind as you're using this technique, and definitely you want to monitor it to make sure that it's actually achieving the aims that you have in mind. This next intervention is really on practicing mindfulness. I think of mindfulness as having a moment-by-moment awareness of thoughts, feelings, bodily sensations, and even the surrounding environment with total acceptance and no judgment. Our research shows that when folks practice mindfulness, they're more likely to make decisions that are aligned to their espoused values. They're more likely to recognize the limits of their own knowledge, and they're more likely to objectively assess uncertainty and not rely on implicit associations or heuristics, right? So what this might look like in practice is practicing or using a 1-minute mindfulness exercise before having a difficult conversation or before completing a particular procedure. And if you feel like uncomfortable, if you don't know like how to do mindfulness, there are some really short and some are longer, like YouTube videos that I'll often use that are a minute long, right? And they're guided meditations. And there's a few different studies that show when this is once again completed before decision-making process, folks actually make better decisions in the long run. I do have one built into this PowerPoint, but I also realize we're short on time. So I will I will skip it. And the final intervention that I'll talk about is priming with counter-stereotypical exemplars. Oftentimes I'll use videos or vignettes or portraits or photos within the physical space to really counteract stereotypical notions that we might have of certain individuals or groups of people. There's one study, for example, that's on the moral elevation of gay men that showed that when subjects or participants of that study were primed with images and narratives of gay men who are painted in positive light, so as family men, as contributors to society, as folks who held jobs, et cetera, that later on participants in the study were more likely to kind of look at them and rate them favorably, right? So we found that this kind of moral elevation reduced associations with gay men towards like stereotypical things like being hypersexualized, et cetera. So once again, I've talked about a little bit about like how this could be used in practice, whether it's through images that appear in physical spaces and walls, or if it's simply introducing materials like at the start of meetings or professional development events that really counteract some of the stereotypes that exist out there. Before I kind of move into connecting this to healthcare a bit more, I just want to emphasize a couple of things. The first one is that addressing implicit bias is necessary but not sufficient for achieving educational equity or healthcare equity. Dave spoke about this in his presentation earlier. There's obviously much more work that needs to happen. We need to address systems and structures and institutional racism, opportunity gaps, et cetera. But this is a piece of the puzzle that needs to be addressed as well. Also in the social sciences, there's no proof, only theory. So the interventions that I talked about might have worked in some cases or context, but not necessarily others, right? So it's important to make sure that we're using these interventions responsibly and monitoring kind of progress over time, right? Or at least checking in with ourselves. Does it seem to be working? And like, how do we know? And then finally, just keeping in mind this idea that theories are not definitive or absolute. So once again, these things can change or be debunked over time. So I just like to say that, right, as a responsible kind of user of this research. So I think that there's time towards the end of this, Dr. Holly, correct me if I'm wrong, for us to kind of move into discussion about, is it both presentations or are we going into breakout rooms?
Yeah, if anyone has a question, certainly now regarding implicit bias, now is a good time. And then we'll get into the sessions after the question. So I think I saw Seppi's hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Holly, and thanks to the speakers. Really, thank you for joining us. Julia, if I could ask you one question about your thoughts on whether it's useful for any of these kind of implicit association tests. You know, there was that classic one, I think, through the Harvard system, the IAT. Is there been shown to be value in folks taking that and at least having some insight? Because, you know, the definition almost is that you don't have insight, but does that help folks, or does that have any impact on addressing it, I guess, would be my question.
Yeah. So I have to say I'm a little biased. I worked for Project Implicit before UCLA. So shed a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in the lab there. And I would say yes. I think it's most useful for awareness, right? Unfortunately, there's very little research. Even the interventions that I presented today, the research shows that they might work in the short run. For example, like mindfulness. You know, if you do a mindfulness activity today, it might improve decision-making right after that. But if you do a decision-making task in 48 or 72 hours later, your decision-making is back to what it was, right? So these interventions have to be employed regularly. The IAT doesn't lead to any changes in behaviors, but what it can do is illuminate places where you might have particular biases. So if you're not familiar with the IAT, there is a race-based version of the test. There's a skin color version of the test. There are even tests that look at whether or not you might have implicit preferences for slim people versus heavier or overweight people. There are folks there, I think there are tests that see if you prefer, I think there's one like around neurodiversity, but there are all sorts of things, many of which I hadn't considered. So I found them helpful with just taking them to kind of learn about where my implicit preferences lie, and then thinking about what I can do to address them. They should not be used to, in settings like this, for folks to take and have to share their results publicly. But I think if folks are taking them and just, thinking about the results and sharing them perhaps voluntarily, then that's okay.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for the question, and thanks for the great presentation, Julian. So now I think Kayla and Sophie are going to put us in some breakout rooms. And I think there's a couple things we can talk about. Let's first, in our groups, have a little discussion, everyone share kind of where they feel they've done well in terms of incorporating JEDI principles in their programs, and whether it's in their work or their school or whatever they're doing. Talk about that, and also talk about perhaps where you've had some challenges. And then what we'll do is we'll do that for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll come back together for about 10 minutes and kind of share what some of the groups talked about.
All right, so I'll open the breakout rooms up, and I will also stop the recording just for everyone's information. You should all receive an invitation to join the breakout room, so you'll just need to accept that.